Welcome to our first lecture of the week as we shift our focus from the Great Depression and the New Deal to World War II. And we will start our study of World War II by looking at the causes of the war, what was going on globally, internationally, that led to the outbreak of war in the late 1930s. And then we will finish today's lecture with a discussion of America's positioning and particularly America's resistance, their reluctance as a nation to join the war. So let us start by examining the causes of the war. So you'll recall earlier this semester we discussed World War I, also known as the Great War, in great detail, and we ended up our unit on World War I by discussing the Treaty of Versailles. That was, of course, the international peace treaty that ended the war in 1919. We mentioned Woodrow Wilson and his efforts to shepherd some key items into the Treaty of Versailles and how he failed to get some of those items passed for a variety of reasons, particularly the biggest one being the League of Nations, which was Wilson's idea, but met with great resistance by Republicans in the U.S. Senate during that time period. And of course, America did not join the League of Nations that was established in the Treaty of Versailles. But there was a League of Nations that resulted from the Treaty of Versailles. However, as we take a look at the early to mid 1930s, while America is enveloped in the Great Depression and FDR has his hands full trying to solve this unprecedented economic crisis, and he's coming up with New Deal policy after New Deal policy and then trying to play the political game to get these bills passed through Congress so that he can sign them into law and put them into action for the American people. While all of that is going on in the U.S., there are some interesting things taking place across the globe, particularly in Europe and in the Pacific, one of which is the rise of authoritarian governments in Germany and Italy. So let's talk about Germany first. If you recall from our discussion of the Treaty of Versailles, there was a specific clause in the treaty known as the War Guilt Clause, and it was something that Wilson was wary of, but Britain and France's leaders, David Lloyd George, Great Britain's Prime Minister, and Georges Clemenceau, who was the President of France, for the Versailles Treaty, they were insistent on the War Guilt Clause being included in the Treaty of Versailles, which basically stated that Germany had to accept responsibility, total responsibility, for World War I. And as a penalty for causing the war, Germany had to cede some of its territories, as well as make some financial payments, some reparations, if you will. And there were very, very strict limitations on the German military in terms of how large of a military they could have and essentially how powerful a military they could build. They were under sort of strict limitations. As you might imagine, this did not go over very well in Germany with the German citizens, and there were certain German politicians that also did not agree with the War Guilt Clause, were incredibly resentful of the war guilt clause. And Adolf Hitler, who was one of these politicians who had deep-seated resentment toward the Allies from World War I for the Treaty of Versailles and the pain that it inflicted on Germany. And knowing that many of his fellow Germans felt the same way, he took advantage of this sentiment of collective resentment that existed in Germany at the time for the Treaty of Versailles and used that collective resentment to seize power. He was very effective as a public speaker and was able to persuade audiences to support him. Hitler became Germany's chancellor in 1933. Within a year, he had claimed the title of Führer, which is national leader of all of Germany, and Hitler's party, the National Socialist Party, also known by their nickname, the Nazi Party, they took control of the country's government, national institutions such as the police, and they also began to rebuild Germany's military during this time period of the early to mid 1930s. While all of this is taking place in Germany at the time, Benito Mussolini, another authoritarian leader, was in control of Italy. Mussolini had come to power in the early to mid 1920s, and he basically had complete control of the Italian government by about 1925 or so, and he quickly formed an alliance with Hitler and Germany. So all of a sudden, you have two European countries that were part of the Central Powers in World War I. That was the group of nations that lost to America, Great Britain, and France, those being the primary members of the Allied powers in World War I. And now, only about a decade and a half later, these two countries now are under totalitarian governments, authoritarian regimes, in which Hitler for Germany and Mussolini for Italy basically more or less had the same level of influence and the same level of power that a dictator would have in a totalitarian government. And both of these men and both of these nations are resentful over the way things ended in World War I. So, I mentioned that Hitler went to work in terms of building back Germany's military. Once he was able to effectively do that by the mid-1930s, he then sought to reclaim German territories and eventually expand. Germany annexed Austria in 1938, and around that same time it signaled its intent to claim the Sudetenland, which is a specific region of Czechoslovakia, which is now known as the Czech Republic. And this specific region of Czechoslovakia had a majority German population at the time. And when Hitler was able to take the Sudetenland, it was quite alarming to Britain and France, but both of those countries ultimately decided that they were not going to oppose Hitler as he reclaimed the Sudetenland. The Czech government as well was willing to cede that particular region of their country to Germany as long as Hitler promised from expanding further. It was an attempt at appeasing Hitler. And Germany, if we give you this section of land, you'll stop expanding and you'll just be content to run Germany, run Austria, and run the Sudetenland. Um, this policy was known as appeasement, and the leaders of Britain and France essentially appeased Hitler in the hopes of containing him. Really, when you get right down to it, both Britain and France were very wary of another world war. They did not want to participate in another world war, and they wanted to do anything they could do diplomatically to prevent that from happening. We talked about it when we discussed World War I earlier this semester, that it was known as the Great War for a reason. I mean, it was just an incredible amount of death that occurred, death of soldiers on all sides, death of civilians. There's an entire generation of European men that were more or less wiped out as a result of World War I. They lost their lives due to World War I. It was an expensive war to fight, and it dragged on for years because of the trench warfare aspect of it. It lended itself to a stalemate, resulted in stalemate, I should say, and it got to be expensive for all sides, both in terms of money and war debt, but also in terms of human capital, the humans that were lost to the war, both on the military side and the civilian side. So Britain and France want no part of another world war at this time. And they view Hitler as a threat. They're alarmed by Hitler's audacity, frankly, in rebuilding the German military and claiming some of these territories, but they ultimately think that they can contain him, that they can deal with him if they just ensure that he doesn't go any further than taking the Sudetenland. This, of course, did not work, as Hitler was had much grander designs than just taking Austria and the Sudetenland, and by the spring of 1939, he had seized the remainder of Czechoslovakia and made it very clear that he was intending on going after Poland next. This really alarmed Britain and France, but in September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France subsequently declared war on Germany. If you take a look at the image in the upper right-hand corner, this is a political cartoon of the time period when Hitler was taking these lands and being the beneficiary of the appeasement policy from Great Britain and France. That in the cartoon you can see Hitler walking over the backs of foreign leaders, and I don't know if you can see it all that well in the picture here, but the words in the lower left-hand corner of the cartoon identify the individuals whose backs that Hitler is walking on. It says spineless leaders of democracy, and the word leader is in quotes rather. So spineless leaders of democracy. So these guys hinting that the leadership of Britain and France and other Western European nations are shrinking from their duties of standing up to Hitler by engaging in this sort of appeasement strategy. And the caption at the very bottom of the cartoon reads simply, "Stepping stones to galaxy," meaning today it's Austria and the Sudetenland. Sooner or later, Hitler's going to try to rule the world and rule the universe. So that was a political cartoon at the time. People were aware and alarmed at the rise of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s before the invasion of Poland in 1939. But the leadership of Britain and France, like I said, very reluctant, very reticent to challenge Hitler until it was really too late. They basically wanted to do what they could to keep the peace, relatively speaking, and avoid a full-scale, all-out world war like they had in World War I. The memories still very fresh of World War I. Shifting gears from Hitler and appeasement and what's going on in Europe during this time, let's take a look at Asia and in particular the Pacific Rim region of Asia. We have, much like Hitler in Germany in Europe, we have another nation that is simply unsatisfied in the early 1930s with just ruling its own country, and they have set their sights on acquiring additional territories, and this, of course, is Japan. Japan is looking to expand in the early 1930s. They have their sights set on territorial expansion. So it started in the fall of 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria, which was a Chinese province, so it's part of China. They invade Manchuria, and months after they initially invade Manchuria in February of 1932, they had the Japanese military had established control of the region. The Chinese government complained to the League of Nations. The League of Nations investigated and ultimately declared that Japan was guilty of violating their policies and international law in the Manchurian invasion. Japan's response was to leave the League of Nations and become a country that was increasingly isolationist and not wanting to deal with any Western nations as well as any other Asian nations from a diplomatic standpoint. This decision also provides an avenue for Japan's military leaders to essentially seize control over the country's foreign policy, and by 1937, Japan will invade China, and not just one Chinese province like they had with Manchuria 6 years earlier, but they'll invade the entire country and try to overtake the entire nation. Within months of doing this, in the summer of 1937, Japanese forces seized Beijing and then subsequently seized Shanghai and Nanking. In Nanking, in particular, Japan asserted its military strength by killing approximately 300,000 Chinese soldiers and citizens. The numbers vary. It's estimated, but it basically amounts to about 250 to 300,000 Chinese citizens who lost their lives when the Japanese military invaded Nanking. In addition, Japanese soldiers raped thousands of women in Nanking. We're talking tens of thousands of women in just a horrific violation of human rights. It is an event that would become known as the Rape of Nanking, and it's still one of the most horrific human rights violations of the 20th century, certainly in the first half of the 20th century in particular. It's something that's very, very ugly part of world history, as well as both Japanese history and Chinese history. So that's what was going on in Asia at the time. Is Japan, much like Germany and Italy and Europe, is asserting its dominance from a military standpoint and putting the world on notice that they are not going to be content until they have achieved some measure of imperialism and colonial land and basically taking over other countries, in this case China, to enhance their own natural resources and their own wealth, and trying to enhance their own economy by having control over their neighbor's economy as well. And that's sort of at the root of all of this too. It's more than just a power and control impulse from these foreign leaders, but also all of these nations had run into hard times financially in the 20s, in the 30s, economic devastation, as well as embarrassment in the case of Germany and Italy in particular, with the war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty. So it's a combination of factors that lead to these countries embracing authoritarian government regimes and also basically invading other nations unprovoked and basically asking for a war. They're just trying to see how much they can get away with, and they are certainly not going to be appeased, as Britain and France found out in their dealings with Hitler in the late 1930s. So, let's take a look now at America. How does this impact America as chaos is beginning to unfold in Europe and also in Asia? What's going on in America? What do American citizens think about this? What do America's political leaders, including FDR, who is president at the time, think of what's going on overseas during this time period? And Americans, like their counterparts in Britain and France, were initially very reluctant to use military force as a method of dealing with the growing authoritarian regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan. In fact, Congress passed the Neutrality Act of 1935, signed by FDR, which prohibited the sale of arms and munitions to belligerents, and belligerents was specifically defined as any countries that were at war, any warring nations. So the U.S. couldn't sell supplies or munitions or weapons to those countries, whether they were allies or had been allies previously in World War I, or whether they were had been previously enemies of the U.S. In addition to taking control over Austria and the Sudetenland, Hitler, along with Mussolini, supply support to Francisco Franco in Spain, as there was a civil war that broke out in Spain during the late 1930s, and Hitler and Germany aided Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. And as that's going on, Britain and France and the U.S. basically, for lack of a better term, stood pat. They just sort of let it happen. FDR believed that maintaining neutrality was the only viable option, again, in order to avoid a full-scale global war. Now, America hadn't lost quite as much in human capital or economic capital with regard to World War I as they hadn't lost as much as their counterparts in Britain and France, but they'd still it was a costly war financially and with the loss of American lives. And especially with the Great Depression going on in 1937, 1936, 1937, not many American citizens really have the stomach or the desire, or whatever you want to call it, to engage in another global war across the ocean from America. Congress passed the Second Neutrality Act in 1937, which extended the arms restrictions, and also it prohibited Americans from traveling on ships operated by warring nations, countries that were at war, in an attempt to essentially avoid a Lusitania-type situation. If you remember from our World War I unit, the Lusitania was the ship that had a 1,000 passengers on it, including over 100 Americans who died, which was one of the big shifters of public opinion toward America involvement in World War I. With the Second Neutrality Act passed in 1937, by prohibiting Americans from traveling on passenger ships operated by foreign countries that were at war, the U.S. government is trying to make sure that a Lusitania-type situation doesn't happen in the 1930s. Despite America's isolationism, both throughout the general public as well as in the political leadership, Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes increasingly concerned with Germany's rise and what's going on across the ocean in Europe, particularly by 1939, when Germany had seized control over Czechoslovakia. Roosevelt started to pivot away from his stance of neutrality. He was particularly alarmed by the audacity of Adolf Hitler and the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, and potentially in Japan as well. Now, ever the astute politician, Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew that he couldn't publicly take a position on the issue. He had to remain neutral publicly. However, he used a radio address, one of his fireside chats, to inform the American people that he realized it was difficult for regular, ordinary American citizens to maintain a position of neutrality, particularly if they had ancestors or relatives, or friends that were in France or Britain or in Europe that were perhaps potential targets of Hitler in Germany. So Roosevelt and the U.S. government remained officially neutral, but he again publicly states that he realizes the American public is going to have an opinion on what is going on in Europe, and that it would be foolish to expect the American citizens to remain completely neutral and not take a side in this escalating conflict that is on the brink of breaking out into full-on war. Of course, that happens in the fall of 1939, and by the summer of 1940, Germany had overtaken France. They had complete control over France by mid-June of 1940, and with France under control, Germany and Hitler set their sights on Britain. And Roosevelt is extremely alarmed at this point. He realizes that Britain is, he doesn't know if Germany wants to come over and invade the U.S., but Britain's sort of the last hope for Western Europe at this point. So with Roosevelt's support, Congress appropriated more than $17 billion to the defense budget in order to build up supplies, including planes, arms, and munitions. Some of this they sold to Britain so that they could defend themselves against Germany. Some of that was to build up the American military. And that's the thing. After World War I, the American military decreased in size. It wasn't non-existent by the late 1930s, but it was on a much smaller scale. They wanted to have an all-volunteer military and not necessarily a professional military class or a large professional military class. And that was another reason why Roosevelt wanted to remain neutral, because it was going to take some time to build the military back up, both in terms of weapons and supplies and ammunition, and in terms of manpower and human resources. By the fall of 1940, Congress approved a peacetime conscription, the first time in American history that there had been a conscription when America was officially at peace. And this, under the terms of this conscription, all American men between the ages of 21 and 35 had to register with the government via selective service. And there was a lottery and a draft, and individuals that were drafted and found fit to serve were required to spend at least 1 year in the military, serve at least 1 year in the military. And this sparks a debate between two factions of Americans, both at the political level or at the elected official level and at the grassroots level politically. One group is the internationalists. They believe that America needs to get involved and help Britain as much as they can, because Hitler needs to be kept in check so that he doesn't come over to the U.S. and try to invade America. The other group were isolationists, and isolationists believed that America needed to stay out of the war. They accused Roosevelt of dragging America into a war that, frankly, they felt was unnecessary and did not concern the nation. But through the $17 billion appropriation and the aid to Britain, as well as the peacetime conscription, the isolationists felt that that Roosevelt was clearly bringing America to the brink of war, and it was only a matter of time before they thought that he would. They thought it was only a matter of time before Roosevelt would officially lead America into war, and they did not agree with that at all. They didn't think Germany had any intentions or designs to take over America. Both of these groups each form their own official organization to sort of rally support and get the message out there. From a policy standpoint, the internationalists, the group that they came up with was the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. And a few months after the internationalists formed that organization, the isolationists formed their own group, their own committee, which they called the America First Committee. Let's worry about America and America first before we stick our nose into any sort of military conflict in Europe or Asia or anywhere else in the war. Was what their basic principles and beliefs were. If you take a look at the the upper right-hand corner here, you can see that is a pin from 1939. It is an America First Committee pin that states the message of the group quite succinctly, quite clearly. Keep the U.S. out of war. Keep U.S. out of war. There's a nice handy map of the U.S. to drive the point home. It more or less is telling us that the war is not in the U.S. It's not in this map. It's on the other side of the globe, and this group wants America to stay out of war, no matter what it takes. So we'll end things here and pick up on Wednesday with a discussion of what finally prompts America to join the war, and exactly what that looks like when America joins World War II and officially engages and participates in World War II.